Hello everyone, and welcome to the 13th in our ongoing series of lectures on Middle Egyptian and hieroglyphics. Today we will be covering the stative verb. The stative verb is the primary topic of Chapter 8. Chapter 8 does cover other topics. A lot of them do relate to other forms of the verb, stuff dealing with things you've already learned, and some particular narrative past tense stuff relating to the verb aha as an auxiliary. That will be covered along with the miscellany from Chapter 7 in the next video. For now, our focus will be solely on the stative. The stative, a verb form that I personally consider to be a little bit more intuitive to an English speaker than the prospective, which is kind of obtuse, is an adverbial form, much like the circumstantial. It is not a main verb form, unlike the circumstantial. That is to say, you're not going to see a verbal sentence beginning with a stative. It doesn't form main clauses that way. There's an asterisk there. We'll get to that asterisk later, but it does not do the circumstantial thing. Instead, it's used to convey the sense of the result of an action. Something like has stood or is standing, or has gone or is gone. The action has taken place, and now, whatever the stative modifies is in the state of having completed the action, hence the name stative. It describes a state of being. It can be used with adjectives. You can conjugate basically any adjective into a stative. It turns into a verb with the meaning has become X. Nefer, perfectly standard and good adjective, meaning good or beautiful. Turn it into a stative with the appropriate ending, more on that in a minute, becomes nefer kui. I have become good. I have become beautiful. The stative looks very similar to the prospective. It has no gemination in geminating roots, so kebab becomes keb. Your third geminates wouldn't geminate. Other roots are the same as the dictionary form. Among the irregulars, redi also conjugates into d sometimes, like in the prospective, but it's not mandatory, unlike the prospective. Ma'a and wenen do not geminate, which you would expect for a non-geminating form. They become ma or wen. Otherwise, same as circumstantial. Ini and e and u are the same. We also have help from a set of endings. This is a property that is kind of unique to the stative and that is very helpful for the stative. They take these compulsory endings. There is only one case where they won't show up. Sometimes the third masculine singular or plural, like common plural really, do not have the ending written. That's because the ending is the vowel u, W in writing, and the Egyptians did not always like to write their vowels. In speaking, it would have always been used. They're not the same as the suffix pronouns. They're not actually pronouns at all. They are a form of subject and modifier agreement. There aren't really a ton of examples in English, unfortunately, just the nature of the language. If you speak a language like German or Spanish or whatever, you will know that oftentimes adjectives have to take on an ending in order to agree with the noun they modify. This is the same deal. It's how you have to say the word to make it make grammatical sense with whatever is being modified. In the same way you can say a and then refer to a plural thing. Like you can't say a dogs. You have to just say dogs or the dog or something that agrees with the plurality of the noun. Stative endings, same way. These are the singular endings. The first person, that's pronounced kui. It is most commonly written like this, but there are a dozen different ways to write this ending. Sometimes one or more of the letters is dropped. The K is always going to be there. The W is almost always there. Sometimes they forget to write the I. Sometimes the I is the letter I instead of the man I, which, by the way, the man version of the I is being used because it's a first person singular that's also I, like it is with the suffix ending. So for consistency, that's just how the Egyptian writers chose to do it. I believe that this does follow the general Egyptian trend that if you're using a first person, that hieroglyph is whatever the speaker is, although it's almost always going to be the seated man. The second person common is T. That little candle wick thing is a biliteral for T, TI, and then is followed with an I. Then for the third masculine, sometimes it's nothing. In the book, that's what that like 0 with a line through it symbol means, is just no ending, or it's the quail chick W. I guess it could also, like in theory, be the other kind of W with a little curly Q, but same difference. And then the feminine ending is the TI. Occasionally, it will also just be written with the T, in which case it's just a loaf of bread T ending. But more commonly, it is the TI. Do be careful though that the other ending does show up sometimes, and that can also, I believe, happen with the second person. Is it can just be a T if they feel like dropping their vowels. The stative endings in the plural, which are a little less ambiguous, like because they're written the same way most of the time, are win, W-Y-N, with plural strokes, but no final W. That's just to let you know that it's a plural ending. Tuni, those two strokes are pronounced as a Y, just to keep things confusing. And that thing that's first, that's not the olive bird. That's a different bird. It's a T-I-W or T-Y-W bird. Yeah, I think it's the I for Tuni. And then the third common plural is the same as the third masculine singular. It's either nothing or it's the quail chick. So it's going to be most obvious what's going on when you have a first or second person, or when you have a feminine noun being modified. Masculine or plural nouns might not have an ending, but if there's a W, you can bet it's a stative. One of the main uses of a stative is using either just a stative verb or a whole clause made out of a stative as the adverbial comment in a non-verbal sentence. You will remember that a non-verbal sentence consists of an opening particle, usually you, sometimes mech or something else even, and then the subject, maybe some adjectives for the subject, and then an adverbial comment, something like a whole clause that's modifying that subject. Maybe some prepositions or whatever. The stative can serve as that adverbial comment. It works pretty much the same as using the hair plus verb to express ongoing action, but the meaning is different. In both cases, you have you, subject, pseudo-verbal adverbial construction. I say pseudo-verbal meaning like it includes a verb, but it's not behaving as a verb, except where hair plus verb would mean the action is still happening. The general sense of the stative is that the action is done, and now you can describe it. So, like, the verb for stand doesn't come from the top of my head, but if you were to use it with hair, you hair stand, whatever it is, that would be I am standing. But if you were to say you stand kui, it would be I am standing. And remember your endings, the kui has to agree with the thing that is, or I have stood rather. The kui has to agree with the thing that is doing, or that is being modified. So in that case, because it's I, it would have to be the first person singular ending kui. In general, there could be exceptions, but in general, the topic of the sentence is the thing being modified by the stative. So your stative should be in agreement with that topic. Here is a quick example. This one actually does have the verb for stand. This is a very simple example. We're going to see a variation of it soon. Uf acha cher wat. Uf is just he is, or he was, or whatever. And then aha is the verb meaning to stand. Because we have a noun followed by a verb, we can guess that it's a stative. It wouldn't make a lot of sense for it to be like an infinitive in a bound construction. That would produce a very strange meaning, like him of standing is what that would mean, and that's nonsensical. So you can write that off, which only leads a stative. The ending isn't written, but it's a third person singular, so that's fine. We know it's implied as the W. And then ker wa'at, on the road. So you can see how it's just acting as that adverbial modifier for a noun, or in this case, a pronoun. The full translation given by Hoke is he was standing on the road. And the reason it could be he is, I suppose, also standing. The tense isn't really given here, but certainly he had stood up on the road is the literal sense, but in English we prefer to express it as he was standing or is standing. The stative is also used to form circumstantial clauses, as you would expect from an adverbial verb form. It's basically the same as the previous case, but here, instead of using a nonverbal sentence structure, you're using a verbal sentence structure. And it requires some kind of antecedent. There has to be something that is being modified. Usually, that's the thing right in front of the stative verb. That tends to be how it gets written. You could probably, much like in English, construct this sort of like convoluted sentence where it's actually modifying something else, and the ambiguity is cleared up by grammar and like what person and number is being referred to, but really it's gonna be in front of the stative verb 99 times out of 100. So just expect and count on that basically all of the time. Other than that, it behaves like any other circumstantial clause. There's no introductory particle. It follows the main clause where the adverbial comment would go, and it is related in some way, in this case by the modification of the antecedent relationship to the main clause. Now, that being said, this is a little more ambiguous than the regular circumstantial in terms of when the thing being described happened. As with the regular circumstantial, it is important to use context clues. Note especially, this is something Hoke made special note of and I think is important also. The stative portion might actually be something that happens after the main verb happened, which is not something that could normally happen in a circumstantial clause. Remember that if you're just doing like a regular circumstantial relationship, you need to have the circumstantial clause either is the setup to the main clause or it's something that's happening simultaneously. You know, one person does one thing while someone else does another thing. It would be a perfectly fine circumstantial. But you need to do other stuff to make things happen after. A chefet plus infinitive would be fine, or even a chefet plus perspective. And the other option is statives. Do allow for things to be happening after. A general rule of thumb is that if you're dealing with a circumstantial clause, if you find that there's a noun or pronoun immediately followed by a verb that could perhaps relate to it in some way, probably a stative, especially if the verb that follows that noun does not have another noun after it. A verb followed by a noun without a related noun immediately preceding it generally indicates a sejamuf passive, which can convey similar ideas. This is especially true if there's a suffix pronoun afterwards, because statives don't take suffix pronouns because they are not nouns or verbs. It would be nonsense for an adverb to be possessed or to have the sort of suffix conjugation relationship going on. This is why I say that word order matters. If you are good enough at doing word ordering and parsing to place every word in the sentence in its place and understand why it is there, it will be immediately evident to you whether you're dealing with a stative or a sejumuf passive by seeing what depends upon what. You cannot do that by half measures. You really have to pay careful attention to the ordering of the sentence, or else you might have a hard time arriving at a correct translation. Here is a quick example. You will note that it is very similar to the previous example. I picked this one deliberately for that reason. First, we have a regular main clause. You pechanef we. He reached me. Pech to reach, and it's the past tense. Our subject is F, him, and then we have an object, we, and then we have a verb immediately after. Aha. Interesting. Aha kui. It's a stative. It agrees with we, first person singular. So now we know we are dealing with a stative. Aha kui means is standing or was standing. And then we have herwat, on the road. So we put the two sentences together. He reached me. It's a circumstantial, so in this case we could probably assume that it's in the same time frame. That's the thing that would make the most logical sense. So as I was standing on the road. That's, again, the most logical thing, but because of the peculiarities of circumstantial clauses, you could probably construct slightly different translations with different temporal senses. Context matters. The stative can also just modify a noun. In those cases, it follows the noun that it modifies. This is especially common to have happen when the main verb of the sentence is something like found or saw or something like that. So I found it open or I saw him standing are perfectly good stative phrases. You'd have, the structure would be you and then your main verb, and then you would have a noun, and then a stative that modifies and agrees with that noun. So if you get like a particle, verb, noun, verb pattern, that probably means that a stative or stative phrase is modifying that noun. Again, even more context clues. It might also be a circumstantial clause. The meaning wouldn't be terribly different. I compare and contrast, I found it as it was open, or while it was open, and I found it open. Not really terribly different in meaning, but technically different in parsing. There is some ambiguity. Again, be careful, follow context clues, support whatever gives you the most logical interpretation and translation. Here's a very simple example. It's I found it open. Gemeni, I found set it wep, really wepu, open. The stative also has a very interesting and unique role because it has to sub in for a kind of a hole in the circumstantial. There's no past tense circumstantial for a verb of motion. You can have a stegimef form perfectly fine, but if you want to say went instead of go, you need a different form. And what you specifically need is a stative. It's pretty simple. You're just using a stative as an adverbial comment on a nonverbal sentence, and you're using a verb of motion. So shem, for example, to go. To form the past tense of that, I went would not be shem-eni, but would instead, or you shem-eni, but would instead be yui shem-kui. Not that big of a distinction. It'll be pretty obvious what's going on when you see it. This is the kind of thing that probably caught a lot of people trying to learn the language while it was being spoken off guard. This is like a pretty easy mistake to make in writing, but just something that it'll show up. Don't be surprised when you see it. All right, that is everything we have to cover on the stative. Next up, we have our video on the remainder of chapters 7 and 8. That will especially deal with the verb aha. You'll find it very helpful for when you start work on the shipwrecked sailor, which, even if you're not taking this for a class, I sincerely recommend that you do. It is very good for translation practice.